How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Fordham Firesides. Today I have a very exciting guest. He's the first member of Fordham faculty to be on the podcast. He's my religion professor, Intro to New Testament. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Larry Welborn.
Thank you, Hank. Very glad to be your guest. I'm very pleased that you're taking my class, and in fact, as I've told your class, they are rock and roll.
I appreciate that. I do really enjoy your class. It's been like the most interesting theology class I've ever taken between high school and college. So
Thank you.
You have a great teaching style. So you were born in Mississippi?
Deep in the South, a little Indian town about 45 miles south of Memphis called Senatobia, which in the Chickasaw language means place of sweet waters.
Okay.
And I used to tell a joke when I was a PhD student at the University of Chicago. Of course, Chicago is also an Indian name, which means field of stinking onions.
Field of stinking onions. That's what Chicago means.
Yeah, so I went from the place of sweet waters to the field of stinking onions.
So how did that happen? What made you well, why don't we start with I guess growing up in Mississippi. What was that like for you?
Yeah, that was in the late 1950s, a long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
The South was a very conservative place in those days.
Mm-hmm.
There were still echoes of the Civil War, believe it or not.
Really?
In the McDonald's restaurant on the freeway in my little town, Senatobia, there is a picture of a group of Civil War veterans who assembled to have their pictures taken. And in the very center of the picture is an old man leaning on a cane with a white beard, and his name is William Welborn.
Oh, really?
My great-grandfather.
Really?
But in my childhood, great change was taking place. Martin Luther King was marching up and down the streets of the South, first Montgomery, of course, and then Birmingham, and then Selma, and eventually he came near to my hometown, to Memphis.
Okay.
And led a strike by the garbage workers. I was a child. I was 10 or 12 years old one night when suddenly we heard on the news that Martin King had been shot dead.
Oh, no.
In Memphis. We had been visiting my mother's sisters, and we were driving south back to my little town in northern Mississippi. And by the time that we reached the edge of town, the Holiday Inn was already burning. So it was a time of great social change and upheaval.
Okay. How old were you at that time?
Oh, well, of course I was born there. My grandfather was an old country doctor.
Okay.
And, we lived on a farm. My father raised cattle.
Yeah.
And I guess I lived there until I was 10 or 12 years old.
Okay. Huh. So what made you want to do teaching, and it's theology specifically?
Thank you. Well, I was raised in a very religious environment.
Okay.
And people believed that the experiences of the first Christians, Jesus, Paul, and others, were important, that contact with those experiences could change your life, could make your own life more meaningful. So I grew up in the context of that expectation. And then when I was a junior in high school, I had an extraordinary English teacher, an old Jewish woman, who recognized that maybe I could do better, as she put it, than my parents thought that I could do. She wrote letters and got me into Yale. And when I arrived at Yale, I discovered that by learning the skills of close exegetical reading of the text, language skills, skills for analyzing culture, that I could recover to a large degree the social experience of the early Christians. And that was tremendously exciting. I remember by that time I was married, and my wife and I lived in married student housing at Yale. My classmates would come over to my apartment to work on their exegetical essays, their papers like the one that you wrote.
Yeah, exactly.
And we would get so excited about what we were capable of understanding, what we saw going on in the text and in the lives of people who lived at a crucial moment 2,000 years ago. Often, my classmates, after hours of debate, would fall asleep on the rug in my little apartment, and when my wife got up to go to work the next day, she would have to step over the bodies of sleeping classmates.
That's great. So that was in Yale, and then you went to you got your PhD at University of Chicago, correct?
There were a couple of steps in between, actually.
Okay.
At Yale, I kept being given to read the great works by German scholars of early Christianity from the late 19th, early 20th century. I was at Yale in the late 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
And so the great figures of the past, like Johannes Weiss, Rudolf Bultmann, these were a tremendous inspiration to me. People who used their skill in language and history to recover ancient experience. And so one day I said to myself, I think I'll go to Germany and continue my studies. I applied for a scholarship first from the Rotary Foundation, Rotary International, and then later from a German academic organization called the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, which is
it's a mouthful.
the German equivalent of the Fulbright scholarship. And so my wife and I packed our bags and we went to Germany for 2 years.
Wow.
And learned German, and actually I didn't want to leave. I was so thrilled with what I was learning. But the scholarship money ran out, and so I had to come back. And I went first to Vanderbilt, and then finally to the University of Chicago.
Really? That's awesome. And what did you study specifically at UChicago?
At Chicago, I was in a program called New Testament and Early Christian Literature, and it was not in the Divinity School. It was in the Department of Humanities in the university. So you may know that the University of Chicago was actually a Baptist school that was purchased by Rockefeller.
I did not know that.
And he turned it into a great university. He hired an educator named William Rainey Harper, who traveled to Berlin. This was back in the 1920s. And Harper modeled the University of Chicago on the Humboldt University in Berlin.
Okay.
So unlike most American schools, most American universities are organized around departments within colleges. But the University of Chicago is organized as a series of divisions, or as the Germans would say, Fächer. So you have a humanities division, a social science division, and so forth. And the primary unit of education there is not the department. It is the great professor, der große Herr Professor, which has both its advantages and drawbacks. The advantage is that the University of Chicago has the greatest number of Nobel Prize winners of any university in the United States. The disadvantage is that you don't have the kind of diverse, complex support that a department can provide, where people are encouraged to study with several professors whose ideas cross-fertilize each other.
Huh. Oh, that's fascinating. How many years were you there?
Oh, a long time.
Long time.
It took me a long time. I was wretchedly poor. And I had to go to work. And in those days, jobs in academia were much easier to get than they are today. Today, it's very hard for young scholars.
Really?
But I got a job while I was still a student. at the University of Chicago at a very good graduate school called McCormick, right across the street from the library of the University of Chicago. And I started teaching there before I had even taken my comprehensive examinations, before I had written my dissertation. So really I started teaching too early, but I had no choice.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So what eventually brought you to Fordham University to teach here?
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, after my wife and I left Chicago, my wife worked in those days for a human rights organization called Amnesty International.
Sounds familiar.
And she was the director of membership for the United States. She was asked to leave Chicago and go to Cincinnati and open a regional office.
Okay.
And she did that in 1992, and I applied for a job at a graduate school, theological graduate school in Dayton, Ohio, and I was there for 16 years. We raised both of our boys there.
Okay.
And then one day, I got a telephone call from the chairman of the Department of Theology here at Fordham, a man named Terrence Tilley.
Okay.
Before he came to Fordham, he had been the chair of the Department of Theology at the University of Dayton.
Okay.
And so we knew each other. Together, he and I had created a Greek language program for all of the schools in Southwest Ohio. And so Terrence Tilley called me up and said, Larry, we're looking for a senior level appointment in the field of New Testament and early Christianity. Would you be interested? And so I applied, and somehow I got the job. And that was almost 12 years ago.
So you've been 12 years at Fordham University
Yes.
then? Wow.
Those have been very good years.
Yeah.
The undergraduates I've encountered here are a joy to teach. They love to learn. They light up and engage the subject. I taught for a little while at Vanderbilt before I came to Chicago, substituting for a professor of mine who had health problems. And I would certainly rate the Fordham students better than the students I taught at Vanderbilt.
Wow.
Here at Fordham, I was given the opportunity, together with a group of colleagues, to create a new program of PhD study.
Okay.
That almost never happens now.
Really?
Because departmental budgets are small.
Mm-hmm.
Humanities in general is shrinking all across the United States. But in 2008, not long after I came here, together with some colleagues, we created an interdisciplinary field called Christianity in Antiquity.
Okay.
And we drew not only on the scholars of early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism and a field called patristics, Christianity from the 2nd to the 4th century. We drew not only upon those scholars, but also we incorporated 4 members of the classics department at Fordham and a couple of people from art history.
Huh.
So that program is an interdisciplinary program. It has proven to be very attractive to PhD students.
Really?
Oh, yes. At one time, we had 9 students in the program. There are a bit fewer now, but still a good cohort.
Yeah.
And our students have been very successful. A couple of years ago, one of our graduates competed successfully for a position at Bucknell University,
Okay.
for which about 200 people applied,
Wow.
including scholars from Yale and Harvard. And I know there were Yaleys in there because some of them asked me for letters of recommendation.
Oh, really?
But it was a Fordham graduate
Wow.
named John Pennyman who got the job.
Good for him. Yeah, that's awesome. So is your main area of study and focus New Testament era and on?
Yeah, I tend to focus on the period from just before the beginning of the Christian movement down to about the end of the 3rd century.
Okay.
And within that period, I've paid some special attention in terms of research to the letters of Paul and to a writing a long writing, 65 chapters, by the Christian group at Rome to the Christian groups at Corinth. That writing is called First Clement.
Okay.
It didn't quite make it into the New Testament. It appears in a few Bible manuscripts from the early church, but it didn't quite make it. But it's a long and interesting writing. From the point of view of political theology, it might be the most important document from the early church. At least that was the opinion of the great German scholar Adolf von Harnack. I'm writing a commentary now on that long 65-chapter letter.
Really?
I hope to complete it in 2022, I think.
Really? It's quite a ways off.
Quite a ways off, but I published a monograph on the occasion of First Clement, the reason why the letter was written, back in March of this year, a book called The Young Against the Old, and the subtitle is Generational Conflict in Early Christianity. My theory is that there was an uprising in the Christian community at Corinth. A group of young people deposed, threw out of office their elders. And in the process of pursuing this hypothesis, I learned a lot about generational conflict.
And not just for that specific generation, but for across history?
Absolutely. It turns out that the period that saw the birth of Athenian democracy was also a time of generational conflict.
Really?
And at present, in the preface to my new book, I point out that most of the significant social movements around the world today, young people are involved. So in the Occupy Wall Street movement a couple of years ago, most of those were young people. In the Black Lives Matter movement, most of those are young people. The Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, most of those are young people. And ever since the economy crashed in 2008, the economic crisis fell with force upon the younger generation all around the world. Unemployment rates among the young in European countries like Portugal and Greece, where I've spent quite a bit of time, the unemployment rates among the young there are frighteningly high. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the relationship between the generations.
That's a fascinating topic to cover, I'm sure. I guess just one last thing. Why don't you go through all the classes that you teach at Fordham? Just so
thank you.
Anyone watching who wants to take your class, they can know.
Thank you. Well, I love my teaching at Fordham. Every year I come back to it with the same level of excitement, and I love what I see happening in your class right now. So I always teach a course in Introduction to the New Testament.
Yes, which is the class I'm taking right now.
Yes, it always fills up. 36 students every year, extraordinarily bright young people. It's such a joy to watch you all grow in your ability to read the text closely. And as I write, in all of the letters of recommendation that I write at this time of year for students who are applying for jobs or for graduate school, the skills of close reading of a text are transferable. Transferable to law school, to business school, to communications programs, and so forth. I also teach a course in the life and letters of Paul, which is a little bit higher level course. Every now and then, I teach a course called Moral Decisions of the First Christians, which is a course that asks, how did the first Christians choose in all of the areas of life? Birth, sex, death, politics, the economy. So it's a course in ethics, moral decision-making. At the graduate level, I teach a number of courses. Right now, I'm teaching a course called The Greco-Roman Environment of Early Christianity. In the spring, I'll be teaching a graduate course called The Neighbor, Biblical Witness and Contemporary Ethics. And by the way, some of my graduate courses are open to undergraduates.
Oh, really?
With the permission of the instructor, and I've had some very good experiences.
Okay.
With highly motivated undergraduates in the past.
That's awesome.
In the future, here I'll be teaching a course on the sayings of Jesus.
Okay.
That focuses on individual parables and aphorisms and what their relevance might be for us today. And every now and then I teach a course in the so-called Apostolic Fathers. That's the books that didn't quite make it into the New Testament.
The non-canon writings. Yeah.
Exactly.
Gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
See, I remember from the class.
You do. You remember.
Well, listen, Professor, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a joy. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored.
Of course. I'd love to have you on again sometime, too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. You know the drill. And I'll see you in a few days.